Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for having us here today to talk about the results of our work and that study which you and other members of the committee requested. As you well know and mentioned in your statement, millions of American youths are subjected to bullying each year, and it is all across the country. While much is being done to address this growing epidemic, there continues to be a need for more information about legal and practical approaches to combating bullying. In this context, you asked us to address the following questions. First, what is known about the prevalence of school bullying and its effects on the victims? Second, the approaches that selected states and local school districts are taking to combat school bullying. Third, the legal options federal and state governments have in place when bullying leads to allegations of discrimination. And finally, how the key federal agencies, including education, are coordinating their efforts to combat bullying. As you mentioned, we did just release our report. It's entitled School Bullying: Extent of Legal Protections for Vulnerable Groups Needs to be More Fully Assessed. And I think there were some copies made available of the report here. In this report, we address the questions I just mentioned, and we make recommendations to the Departments of Education, Health and Human Services, and Justice, who are all working on this issue together, to help address the issues that we identified in our work. Today, I'm just going to very briefly sum up our findings and the recommendations in that report. In addressing your first question, we found that bullying is indeed widespread, impacting somewhere between 20 and 28% of youth, and that it has, as you said, long-lasting and sometimes very detrimental effects on victims. However, data on who is being bullied and how often is limited and sometimes conflicting due to inconsistent definitions and demographic information collected in national surveys on school bullying. Federal agencies are currently working on developing a uniform definition of bullying, but have not yet decided whether to expand the type of demographic information gathered in their surveys. Because of this, we included a recommendation in our report that the three agencies work together to develop information in future surveys on the extent that youth in various vulnerable groups are in fact being bullied. Regarding the approaches that states and school districts are taking to combat bullying, we found that all 8 states that we selected for review had enacted anti-bullying laws, and all of the 6 school districts we reviewed had established anti-bullying policies and procedures. However, the states, as the Secretary just mentioned, the states all varied in how they define bullying, who they protected, and what they required the schools to do to address bullying. The 6 school districts we talked to told us about a range of different approaches they take to tackle bullying, including several an adoption of a framework for prevention-oriented framework that's geared towards improving overall behavior in schools. And several schools also sponsored events such as Rachel's Challenge and Ryan's Story that are geared towards promoting a positive overall culture in the school that can also help prevent bullying. As far as the legal options when bullying leads to allegations of discrimination, we found that federal and state civil rights laws offer some protections, but that vulnerable groups are not always covered, as was mentioned earlier. For example, federal agencies lack jurisdiction under civil rights statutes to pursue discrimination cases based solely on socioeconomic status or sexual orientation, as you were talking about earlier. And the civil rights laws in the 8 states we reviewed, while they often went beyond the protections afforded at the federal level, were mixed as to what classes of individuals were protected. Therefore, the extent of protections available under civil rights laws for bullying victims can literally depend on the state that they live in. And finally, Mr. Chairman, we found that despite all the good coordination efforts by Education, HHS, and Justice to carry out research and provide information to the public on bullying, there has not been information gathered on state civil rights laws as they relate to bullying. This information is key to understanding where there may be gaps in civil rights protections for students who are bullied, which is why we recommended that Education do a one-time compilation of state civil rights laws and procedures. Our recommended analysis of these legal gaps, paired with additional demographic information on the frequency of bullying of vulnerable groups, would be instrumental in helping policymakers determine whether additional actions are needed to protect vulnerable groups who are most often the target of school bullying.